So we'll just live our lives. Oh, now somebody's asking me something. But we'll just live our lives. We'll continue with class now. And we'll pretend like this doesn't exist, and it'll get better tomorrow. And tomorrow. And hopefully I'll have all of your addresses by tomorrow so that you can all be in. And those of you who have laptops can put it on the class. If you can silence it, that'd be helpful. Us reverberating back to us. I'm doing a Google Hangout that is also broadcasting, and I invited the people whose addresses I had. So we'll see what happens. All right. Well, the first thing, we have a lot to do today because well, the first good news is that I'm not blind, I'm just old. And I'll explain the mechanics of aging to you later. But the upshot is that I get to see things that you don't get to see. They're called photos. Anyhow, look it up on Google and then go, oh God, I don't know. So that's what happens. But I'm not blind. So they said, you know, it's a good thing you came in. Next time this happens, come in again. Well, they said if I had a detached retina, but they would have needed to do surgery right away. And it's either really benign or it's a detached retina. So it's not anything in between it. So you know, I'm really glad that you were patient with me about the Friday, Thursday. So that meant that I had to put off the beginning of our Zeus discussion, and before we go to the first hour of this, or continue our Zeus discussion, and I also have to add on to that little introduction to the sources, so that you'll be prepared for the online source quiz, which is open book, open note, which we're going to take before Friday this week. The sources for studying classical antiquity, and for those of you in my morning class, you can now turn your brains on and emotionally disengage. The sources for studying classical antiquity, we are meeting them all semester long, and you have, to a large extent, already got the lay of the land. But so that I can make that slide, which is the final slide in your PowerPoint presentation, so that I can make that slide intelligible and give you a little bit better appreciation for what kinds of sources we're dealing with from chapter to chapter, I need to talk with you for about 15, maybe 20 minutes, just to get that information out and up front. There are, broadly speaking, two classes of sources. There are literary, and there are archaeological things that survive from classical antiquity. The archaeological basically includes anything, any physical artifact that survives from 2000 BCE up to 500 CE. Any physical thing that actually was produced by, used by an ancient person speaking Greek or Latin in that period, or aware of these people, that is an archaeological piece of information. This includes all sorts of things. There are included buildings and included in that would be like temples, and there are statues, which can be made out of bronze, marble. Some of them can be made out of silver, and so forth. These statues can be in 3 dimensions. They can be completely done in the ground. I guess really we could call this statue so much as sculpture. So they could be 3D in the round. This would be like statues. And then there could be partially 3D figures that are carved into a flat background of stone called reliefs, so that part of it sticks forward, but most of it is attached at the back. So buildings, these would be important. where there is a temple to a god, that's probably an important place to study that god. In the island of Samos, off of Asia Minor, there's a great temple to Hera. That was a Hera place. There's a temple to Artemis in the Turkish city of Ephesus. There was a great temple to Athena in Athens, which is the Athena place, called the Parthenon, and so on and so forth. So that can be important for studying mythology. Sculpture, we've got sculptured portraits of all the gods, and you see many of them in Carpenter, so forth. We have varieties of painting. Painting happens on vases as well as on walls, and we've seen a lot of vase painting so far in Powell and so far in Carpenter. And one of the things that we're going to try to get good at as we're looking at art this semester is trying to not only know the medium in which it is produced, but also get a sense of the era in which it's produced. I think by and large, you're going to have a pretty easy time saying this thing is archaic and this thing is classical, for sure. Most of the stuff we see is going to be either archaic or classical. Some stuff might be Hellenistic, but by and large, if we're studying Greek mythology, those are the three periods that will be represented most widely. Some things will come from Italy, and so they are either in origin produced in Greece and then just exported to Italy, in which case we still use the Greek system of periodization, archaic, classical, Hellenistic. But there'll be some stuff that's Roman, so there'll be stuff from the late Republic, there'll be stuff from the early Roman Empire, the early imperial period. And so I think you'll find that by the end of the semester, you should be competent, relatively good at differentiating what medium you're dealing with, what period, and what area of the ancient Mediterranean world it comes from. They produced more stuff in the ancient world than just this that's relevant to our study. One form of art that you find is mosaic. Mosaic is when you take little pieces of glass or pottery that is very shiny, and you make little squares out of them, and you fire them so that they become really hard, and then you put them in cement. Mosaic is really a form of art that was quite popular in the Roman world more than the Greek world, and the Romans also had an advantage. When they made cement, and they were really the first great culture of classical antiquity to use cement as a building material. Their cement was made out of volcanic ash from Mount Vesuvius and the like. So what that means is that their cement was about 10 times stronger than any commercial cement that they use now. And so buildings built out of this cement can last for 2,000 years straight. And if you build a mosaic out of that cement, it's going to be here for eons and eons and eons. So, so mosaic, you'll see some art that is shown in mosaic form. The other side, and there are other things here. I could have added other materials like wood, ivory, and so on. I could have added additional forms of art. Jewelry and things like that. But this is the major stuff. This is the stuff that you'll end up seeing in Carpenter. And all of that is ripe for the business of our learning about the ancient gods and the ancient heroes, regionally and individually. And in a class like this, we need to be able to know what we're looking at in order to make pronouncements. And so I've got lots and lots. I say I was really happy with the Zeus sheets from this class. You all uniformly, everybody really did a strong job. And I gave a couple of examples of how certain people did it that might be really an emulation but uniformly, you all did a really wonderful job. Now that you today are getting to know the sources for studying classical antiquity, you can reread your charts now, and you'll get an even better sense of how and why it's meaningful. How and why it's meaningful that Zeus is represented certain ways by Hesiod, a Greek in the early Archaic period, than he is by Ovid, a Roman living in the early Roman Imperial period. It's just very different worlds. And what they're producing, though, has a kind of consistency. One's working in didactic, half of epic didactic, the other one's working in epic. There is and they are talking about a lot of the same things. But having those things organized in your head chronologically, spatially, and by material is an important piece of the business of doing anything with Greek and Roman worlds. Okay. So the other half of the coin, and this is really what Powell is doing, is to look at literary evidence. Now, when we study literary evidence, and I'm a literary person primarily, in our Department of Classical Studies at Mary Washington, there are 3 of us. There is an archaeologist, Professor Hutala, and there's Professor Pitts, who is a Hellenist, so she tends to study more of the Greek literature side, and then there's myself, and I study more of the Latin literature side. We all kind of do everything, to be honest. But within a proliferation of evidence, we do have to specialize within our discipline. And so I probably stand, professionally speaking, more on the literary side. And here we break this down into broadly 2 categories. One of them I'm going to use, which is literature proper. These are the things that were written by the best, brightest, and smartest in classical antiquity. And they were produced for high art, high culture, part of an educational system. And so this is kind of a special category. Yes?
I don't know if I'm going crazy, but I have this lecture in my mythology notes.
Oh.
I think it's the other class that needs the...
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm living in a different world.
I thought you were going on about Arctia, so I thought you'd expand on that, so I waited, but I think you're...
Thank you. Thank you for pausing and stopping out. So now there's 2 evidences of my brain falling apart. Okay, okay, we'll talk about it in a break. Well, thank you for stopping me before I went much longer. That part clearly won't be streamed forever.
Your video is
Yeah, it's working now.
That's okay.
All right, well, I can switch gears very quickly. Thank God, we're going to save us some time because we can get into our Zeus more efficiently. All right. I kept thinking as it was going on, I feel like I've done this in here.
I think we were trying to see if you were just like recapping or if you were really trying to...
No. I couldn't tell. I thought that I had let this class go without this talk for a really long time. And that's why I set it up front. And nobody said anything. And then...
I should have done something because I pulled out my notes for this class, and then I had to pull out my notes for the other class. Fine.
Good. Well, the key thing here, the most important thing about this is that you're ready for the source quiz. And I thought that I was making the source quiz due really soon, and that we hadn't had this talk. And so I felt like, oh, crap. I'm sending them off into the woods without any preparation. And now I know that I'm not doing it. Okay. Zeus. We've met a lot, we've learned a lot about Zeus to this point, and he's such a huge overarching figure. And you've all produced really wonderful, as I've said before, you've all produced really wonderful studies of our God. So that it's going to be an ongoing project. We will read things all the way up until the last chapter that we consider together as a class on the Trojan War. We will read things together that you could and should add to your chart on Zeus. If you really want to understand Zeus, the justice of Zeus, his job as king of gods and of human beings, the conditions that he's imposed upon us. And honestly, when we get to the very end of all the regional systems, what you're going to find a question appearing, at least in my mind, is the Trojan War, and the thing that causes the collapse of the Mycenaean era, is the Trojan War the thing that represents Zeus's final judgment on that age and those people. Because Zeus is the #1 single most important divine thing to understand about the ancient religion, the ancient mythological system, and so he always has to be ever present. Just a thing where you see him, notice him, tack on things in there, and I promise you it will be of use to you when it comes time to write essays for the final exam. You don't have to do big, long, drawn-out things. A lot of the stuff you're seeing just repeats stuff you already know. But you do want to continue to pay attention to this figure of Zeus. Now, we have talked about this chart at some length, but I did want to start my discussion of Zeus on page 145. You're looking at the 12 Olympians. You all did a great job of rehearsing his parentage for me, his concerns, places that are of interest to him, narratives that joined him, and we'll be talking about, considering a few of those narratives today. But it's some of the basic features are maybe best seen when we collect all of that information together, and we assemble it, and then we look at it as a whole. And just such a chart as that is on page 145. Number one, we notice that Zeus, both from this chart and the chart on page 151, is absolutely instrumental, both to the formation of the Olympian system, and number two, to the creation of all that is in this world that of importance in terms of gods, and eventually we'll also discover a lot of the heroes as well. They're all being generated from him at some level. I don't know necessarily that this was originally the case, but I do think that some of the more conservative elements in our ancient sources, like Hesiod, for example, saw Zeus as such an important figure that they started making stories attached to him, where somehow or other Zeus had to be made the father of this guy or the father of that woman, and get a more central role that way. So, just quickly looking at the chart on page 145, Zeus is like Hera, Poseidon, Demeter, and Hades and Hestia. They're all children of Kronos and Rhea, of that second generation of earth-sky marriage. And Zeus couples with 2 goddesses to produce 3 more Olympian gods, his children as well as gods. And if we look at just the chart with Zeus proper, Zeus and Leto, they have the twins Apollo and Artemis. We've already talked about their functions, and we're going through them individually now with the gods. Zeus and Metis. Metis is a word we've already seen with the word Prometheus. Metis is at the root of Prometheus, the person who does the cleverness, the thinking before it is necessary. Well, Metis occurs again now. Now she's a goddess, and it is with Zeus that Metis conceives Athena, a goddess of knowledge, of wisdom. Zeus is also the wife of Hera. The husband of Hera. And Hera, independently as a child, Hephaestus, the god of the forge, but he's defective. He's got a limp, and as such, and that is probably in keeping with the same kind of misogyny that we saw in Hesiod's works and days. That if a woman were to try to make life by herself, it would have to be defective. But Zeus and Hera, troubled marriage that they have, are only able to produce 3 offspring, and only one of them of particular importance among the Olympian deities, the god War. And Ares there is quite symbolic of the really unpleasant nature of their marriage, which you read about in this chapter. Related to Hera's function as the god of childbirth, their third child together is Aletheia. And Aletheia is the goddess of specifically the moment of giving birth, helping the woman live through it and the child live through it. So some of her functions remain intact. Zeus and Maya, on the other hand, produced Hermes, the god of trickery. We talked about the remaining gods. We remember that story of how Aphrodite was born from the bubbling sperm and blood of the severed genitals of Uranos when Kronos severed them to displace his father and install the second generation of gods. But another version of the story of Aphrodite is that there is a goddess, Dione, Titan goddess, that Zeus slept with as well and produced Aphrodite in that way. And that's the version of the parentage of Aphrodite that you find in Homer. So there is not quite a coordinated effort, but there's definitely a collective impulse that drives people to use Zeus as the father of gods. He is a guy that will have to show sexual dominance and procreativity in order to populate the world with all that is, to give it the structure of the world as it is. And that the ancients, both the Near Eastern ones as well as the Greeks themselves, saw that as resembling a family that operates in generations. But what differentiates gods from gods isn't eternalness, because they all live forever, but it becomes the kinds of qualities that Zeus has. And so those are the qualities that the readings in this chapter, I think, try to illustrate. So, first off, Zeus is Lord of the Sky. And here in Homer's Iliad, you remember how we talked about the 2 classes of evidence, broadly speaking? We've got what are the 2 classes? What are the 2 halves of the family when we look at ancient sources? How do they regard gods in this world? What did we talk about last time? What? Oh, primitivism? No, I think that does talk about the early parts of humanity, but I think we were talking about a little bit about attitudes of the ancient sources towards what the god's role is in making the human condition what it is. So I saw your name.
You got the Holy Rollers.
The Holy Rollers.
They're just like, oh, the gods are great. They're amazing. And the free thinkers who are, okay, the gods are really powerful, but they're flawed.
Right, right. And the Holy Rollers might be saying that they're great, but great might just mean really strong. That if they do suck, that's your job to suck it up. As a human being, endure it and take it. Because the gifts of the gods are just gifts, and you can't say no to a gift. Whereas the free thinkers, sometimes I call them the renegades, people like Euripides and Ovid, not always, but sometimes will poke holes and ask questions. Homer is not one of these guys, right? Homer is a holy roller. Homer is definitive of what it is to be a good person, a good Greek in the ancient world. And it's not without complexity, because again, he's not saying necessarily the gods are fantastic and great. Hesiod certainly didn't say that. He said they're awesome and all-powerful. But did he want to be alive in the Age of Iron? No way in the world. Anything but. Anything would be preferable than to live in this era. So what differentiates gods from gods, and what differentiates Zeus from the other gods? And Homer offers this kind of a first-person narration reasoning from Zeus. Zeus says, Book 8 of the Iliad is Homer, Greek poet, archaic period, writes epics. 2 epics survive and are probably authentically Homeric. We'll talk about what that means later. Iliad, just a story that takes place in the final years of the Trojan War, which is the last chronological event of note in the fall of the Mycenaean era and what the later Greeks thought of as the fall of the Age of Heroes. And so the Iliad studies the end of the Trojan War, but it's not looking at the big picture of the Trojan War in the story of the epic. It's looking at a small story about one hero, Achilles, and his problems that he's got with the various people that are in charge. He writes another poem called the Odyssey. If the Iliad is 750, 725, the Odyssey is around 725, so a little bit later poem. And the Odyssey tells the story of another Greek hero after they were victorious in the Trojan War, winding his way back from Troy. If you don't know where it is from that place, winding their way back through the Mediterranean and around the Mediterranean, but he has trouble getting home because he makes a god angry, Poseidon, and it takes him 10 years before he can finally get to his home. So Homer is a poet of the archaic period, writing about the Mycenaeans in the Age of Heroes, and he, like Hesiod, is representing, in my view, a very, very conservative voice in his account of the gods. And he says, "Learn how much stronger am I than all the rest of you gods. If you really want to know, and to prove it to the other immortals, let drop a golden cord from the heavens, and seize the end. Oh, all you gods and goddesses, pull it with all your might. Try as you will to drag me from heaven down to the earth. You cannot move me a bit. I am Zeus, the highest and wisest. But suppose I really wanted to pull you up to the heavens. Up you would come, and behind you would come both land and sea." Land and sea, earth and sea, would come up to heaven. Remember, earth first, heaven above, holy marriage? Heaven just said, I can make earth come up. I could make gravity move towards me. I'm that strong and powerful. That's a huge claim. Up you would come, and behind you would come both land and sea. The cord I would fasten securely to the highest peak of Olympus, leaving its burden to hang, twisting there in the wind. That is how far I surpass in power both gods and mortals. So, that's a great quote for Powell to have found as an illustration of what makes Zeus Zeus. He's not necessarily better than you, although he probably is. He is stronger than you. It doesn't matter what god you are. He's definitely stronger than you. And try to defy him. Try to defy his logic of the universe, and he will physically, not through persuasion or physically, he will make the world the way he wants it to be. That's one way of making your gods. And I don't know that that's completely inconsistent with the gods of the Old Testament. It's a question you can ask yourselves, or you could, review. But at any rate, that's a great place for us to begin with our Zeus. Now, going to talk about Zeus, you can't get away from the name. And his name is, in Greek, Zeus. The Z sound is really not Zeus, it's Z. Z. It's kind of like the letter X is 2 letters. So it's either a DS or a TS, Zeus. And sometimes the letters get turned around, so instead of Zeus, you say Zeus. 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 And this is just a normal ending for the end of a noun. It could be the maker ending, just like we saw with Prometheus. But what's interesting about it is this part. If you go back to languages derived from Indo-European, you will find that this root is the sounds D-I, D. And if you look at this root across the different languages, it would appear that in Indo-European, that is that language spoken by that group of people that became all the European through Indic languages, it would appear that this word, this stem, means bright, shiny. A bright, shining, as in a lit up sky. And what that same root gives us, other words in the culture, it gives us, in Greek, for example, the word deus, and it gives us the word theos, it gives us the word for God. And another Indo-European language, Latin, the word for God is deus, theos, deus. It's that D ending with just a masculine ending in these cases. So the word for God, just God, any God at all, in Indo-European languages is derived from this same root, the bright shining sky. And this is one of the leading reasons why people have thought that the Indo-Europeans were a sky-worshipping people. And when we look at all the artifacts of statuary from pre-Indo-European cultures, their most common goddess is a woman with enormous buttocks and breasts and vaginas. That's the most common statue that you find everywhere. And a strong association with the earth and fertility. And it's really with these guys that the word for God and the things associated with God gets associated with the sky and heavens. And Zeus is just an incarnation. He is the materialization of that idea and that set of priorities. So Zeus is just the word God in just a different form. It's just and it's the Greek word for God, and it's the Latin word for God. The name Jupiter, which is in Latin Jupiter, is just the word, basically, Zeus or Deus, which has become the sound y instead of st or d. It's this word y with the word for father, pater, God the Father, Zeus the Father, Father Zeus. So Zeus is really important. He's really, really important because his name is also the name for God. And it's not an accident that he is set in the sky and that he has an absolutely central position in the government of the gods. And given the fact that they assumed that the gods existed and that we are their creation and we are modeling ourselves after them, it's absolutely essential in a class like this that we come to some understanding and appreciation of Zeus. on pages 148 and following, we see Zeus in his marriage to Hera. It is an unpleasant marriage. And I won't go into that at any great length. And we've seen some of the offspring of their marriage. But Zeus is the most important element about that is that whereas before we were earth worshippers, we now have a marriage, unhappy and as conflicted as it might be, between sky and earth. Zeus, if you look on page 151, is the father of not only Olympians like Athena, Aphrodite, Apollo, and Artemis. So this is part of his prolific parenting. But he's also in this new set of this genealogical impulse where everything's got to be about Zeus. He's also given functions of, for example, he is the one who is the father of the seasons, the Horai, as well as the fates, the Moirai. The Horai are the fact that we don't have growable seasons year-round. We can only grow food part of the year. Zeus is the fault of that. We used to be able, so the story goes, when life was better, we used to be able to just grow food whenever we want. And life was easy. In fact, nature was just providing for us. Zeus made us have to starve in the winter. And before industrialization of agriculture, people used to call spring, the starving season. Because you stop growing food around the end of October, and then you're just living on whatever you could do. Put up the winter jars of stuff, whatever. Until when? April, May? That's when the farmers markets reopen. You're not having food until then, really. Except the odd winter crop. So Zeus is the person who did that. And that's being accounted for genealogically there. He also is the father of the Fates. Normally the Fates are thought of as pretty independent. They're the ones, they're three women, who weave the thread of your life, they measure the thread of your life out, and they cut it at a certain length. That's true at the individual level. It's also true at the level of your civilization, your city, and the men and women who make it up, as well as your entire empire, let's say the Roman Empire. It's all going to be a function of the Fates. If you look at the Hesiodic genealogy back in the 2 chapters ago, the Fates came about through a whole different mechanism, not through Zeus. But here, everything is coming out of Zeus. Everything's being driven by Zeus because he's assuming a more important organizing factor. And what is the relationship between Zeus and the Fates? The Fates are writing the script. Zeus is directing it. Zeus is choosing the personnel. He's making sure that the story arc is being followed. He can allow a little kibitzing here and there. People can improvise. They can slow the action down or speed the action up. But ultimately, the action will happen because that's the kind of guy Zeus is. Zeus has seen the script in advance. It is what pleased him and the gods. It has happy parts and sad parts. But he's in charge of the script. And your job is to play your part. So, so that's that. With Eurynome, he is the father of the Graces. You might wonder, why, pray tell, do I need Graces? But if there is a person with whom you have ever been enamored, and you thought, I like the way that person looks as opposed to somebody else, the way this person smiled. If you like the cream in your coffee a certain way, or you like your shelves organized just so, the Graces are the thing that without which, those things being there, you wouldn't care about that thing. It makes it special, desirable, wonderful. And they had gods for these. Isn't that the best thing ever? That you would have a god that would make something wonderful as opposed to not. And Zeus is the reason that things can be special and delightful. In this account, in Homer's account, He's the father of Aphrodite, the reason we have sexual desires at all. And I won't talk about Persephone so we can in passing, I just noticed that Zeus isn't just interested in women, he's interested in men. And in classical antiquity, that is a perfectly normal set of desires. Have we had sex talk in here, Laura?
We had the Grecians that was talking about.
Yeah, but we haven't had sex talk in here, have we? Do you want to have the sex talk? Huh? You want to have it? Okay. We'll do a little bit of the sex talk. It's kind of a long story, but suffice it to say that usually people in the history of our world take the reality that they know and they just project it back unthinkingly on the past and assume that it must have always been that way. But apparently that might not be the best, or certainly not quite the best, most reliable way of looking at history. What you probably should do is look at what they actually did and then describe that as their normal, and then see when and if anything changed to make your normal. Their normal was quite different than your normal, I think, in the following ways. Number one, there's no such concept as homosexuality. There's no word for it, but there's really no concept of it either. The basic assumption is that, and I guess I'll put another premise behind this too. The basic assumption is that sex is a male-driven thing, that it requires a penis, and that penis can be put places, and that can be put in male places or female places, and that if you were a man, you certainly would have done both at some point in your life. Just a given. There's no word for heterosexuality. There's no word for homosexuality. Now, statistically, Zeus is pretty normal, I guess, in the ancient world. He's got a lot of female sexual partners. But he's also got male sexual partners, one of which is Ganymede. And Ganymede is represented very briefly on page 155. Right. So Ganymede is a noble of the house of Troy, part of the Trojan generation. And Zeus is certainly as interested in attractive boys as he is in attractive girls. That's just a given of this sexual system. And what that would tell you is that sex is not just about procreation. They thought that too. So that idea must have come later. Somebody somewhere along the line, my idea would be some religious situation, would have said sex is only ever justifiable if it's also possible that it could lead to production of children. But that's a later idea. That's not in the Greco-Roman system anymore. It is a very male-driven sexuality. All of the words for the sexuality are about a penis going places. And they barely could wrap their heads around the idea of same-sex relations between women. They didn't have words for them other than to say that they were mocking parodies of what a male sexuality would be like if a woman had a penis. So they're always dismissive, a little bit contemptuous, and not understanding about that. But the men are dominant politically, socially, and it also comes out in their sexual system. So Zeus having a sexual partner that is male would have been not controversial at all. It would have been, yeah, of course he did. That's completely normal. And I guess what would be surprising there, or what befuddles people, at least part of what befuddles people, is the idea that they had an idea of sexual gratification that seemed based on pleasure rather than on procreation. I don't know. I understand some people, even today, have sex for pleasure, not just for reproduce. But I could just guess it. All right, so that's Zeus in a nutshell. In the remainder of this chapter, they introduce the idea of Hades. You're going to be doing a chart on Hades at the end of the God section. And it's going to be a chapter that's all about the underworld. So reserve this in your head and apply this to that chart. But Hades is also going to be a major part of the chapter on fertility that involves Demeter. And everything about the underworld is ultimately about Hades. So everything about the underworld has to find a place in your chart on Hades. And Poseidon is the god of the sea. People didn't go to the sea too often because they feared it. But it was their means of travel. It was the cheapest form of travel, and of course trade. Trade was not done on the scale, the movement of goods and services that we use nowadays, but I think it would be basically accurate to say that these people were capitalists. They had trading partnerships with other people. They produced goods and services that other people wanted and were willing to pay a market price for. These were not markets that were regulated. They were banks that supported the business of trade. It's hard to track because we don't have tons and tons of records. They're always partial. You know, you get one little document from this time in this place, and you wonder whether it's indicative or not. But the sea was something that was quite dangerous. There were lots and lots of shipwrecks. So the kind of people who would be willing to go to sea for the sake of money and capitalism were seen as potentially reckless people. Another reason you might go to sea, though, is also to wage war. War was also a for-profit industry because if you read about anybody sailing anywhere, for example, in all of Homer, they're always sailing there with an idea of, oh, we're going to drop in, we're going to sack that city, we're going to kill or sell off all the men and capture all of the women and children. We'll either take them to our homes as slaves or as wives, or we'll sell them off into captivity. And that is just normal. I'll get in my boat, I'll go take over your city. Yeah. So seafaring is kind of dangerous for obvious reasons. But that is the province of Poseidon, and you know him and respect him. The chapter on Apollo is a relatively long chapter, and the complementary chapter in Carpenter is also similarly long. There's lots and lots of representations. In my first pass at introducing Apollo to you, I showed you this man who was always clean cut. He never has a beard. So he's a relatively younger man. He's often shown in one of his various, in a pose that is indicative of his concerns. Often that's with his bow and his arrow, or it's with his lyre, or it's with the tripod that is found in his oracle. And that gives you something of the range of his functions in this world. Nobody compares with Zeus. Zeus is almighty. He is the centerpiece of this mythology. But Apollo is not a bad guy to put right after Zeus as a way of understanding certain primarily Greek priorities and values about the world that they lived in. And he's got so much tucked in under it. Number one, and maybe I'll start with why putting him right after Zeus. Zeus is omnipotent, right? He is all-powerful, omnipotent. Zeus is also, as father of the fates, omniscient, is all-knowing. You might have thought he'd have exclusive access to all of that knowledge, because he's the most important one. But those functions get distributed and shared by other gods. Apollo is a guy who possesses various forms of knowledge, some of them really specialized, some of them quite broad. One form of knowledge that he shares with Zeus is he shares omniscience. Apollo is the only god other than Zeus that has an oracle. In fact, he has two. He has one oracle at Delphi and a second oracle at Delos, which is why I asked you to learn where Delphi and Delos are. Those places are holy and sacred to Apollo. Delos also to his sister Artemis. And an oracle is a thing. It is a temple. So every city's got temples. But it is a temple to this god, which means that Delphi and Delos are Apollo places for sure, right? So those you would want to have in your chart under special places. And basically the way they work, and here I'm just describing for you the institution at Delphi, is that they have a priestess who sits inside of a bowl with 3 legs on it, called a tripod, and she is. You ask her a question. You go there and you pay money to a group of 10 priests. Could be more, and yeah, more entertaining. So, so the priests are men, and the men take your question and your money, and then they go put it to this priestess. In Delphi, this priestess is called the Pythia, Pythia, the Pythia, and the Pythia will get into a hallucinative state. In some religions, even today, people learn how to speak in tongues, to channel the Holy Spirit, or what have you. The priestess, the Pythia, would do exactly that. Some say it's because there is a fault line outside of Delphi, so that natural gas is emanated from a hole, a break in the grounds right there, and that she would inhale it. Some say that she basically ate shrooms or sucked on opiates prior to getting into this state, and that would help her speak in tongues. And that may well be true, but I don't think she needed drugs to do this. If you live in a culture where there is a person who can be assigned the role of becoming the word is something not written. You are in a state of ecstasy. Ecstasy is the process, that's what cis means, of standing, stop, outside of yourself. Ecstasis. And devotees of certain religions, Dionysus comes to mind, are able to get into an ecstatic state. It can be with or without the state of drugs. But if you believe that you're capable of being filled by the Holy Spirit or filled by Apollo, then by gum, I guarantee you that you are being filled. And we don't have to talk about reality. We have to talk about what these people believe and what everybody else believed. And if they believed it was possible, then certainly it was possible. And so Apollo would fill the Pythia with her presence, with his presence, and make her speak in tongues. And she would just go mad sitting in that tripod and babble and babble and babble. And it was the job of the priests to take the question that they understood in their mind and listen to the things that she was singing, whatever it was she was singing, all the different words, and then to take those words and to put it into the same meter that Homer and Hesiod wrote in. The same meter you write epic or didactic in, that's the meter that the gods speak in at an oracle. And they give you back usually a 2 or a 4 line oracular response. And you go and you live your life in accordance with it. Invariably. Just like when Themis gave Deucalion and Pyrrha kind of a, well, it could be this, could be that, metaphorical, interpretive challenge. invariably the oracle of Apollo at Delphi and all the oracles were ambiguous. You'd have to figure out what it is that God was thinking. And that's because human knowledge, number one, is imperfect and unclear, right? And number two, the gods will never tell you exactly what they're thinking. Yours is a world of uncertainty. They live in certainty, but you live in uncertainty. No getting around that. Okay? So Apollo would fill you with ecstasy and share with you, albeit metaphorically, his knowledge with you, share his omniscience. There's a few other areas, and they're all kind of represented here. Our sources in this chapter are not lots. There's really maybe two sources that are represented at length. One of them is called the Homeric Hymn to Apollo. And in the chapters in this book, you're going to read a number of Homeric hymns. Homeric hymns are little poems written in the same meter as Homer and Hesiod, called dactylic hexameters. And these are like kind of hymns that you would sing as warm-ups at a poetry recitation contest, where the main dish would be Homer. But these little guys would be done to warm up the audience. And so this big long poem about Apollo, the Homeric Hymn to Apollo, would be a prelude to something bigger, like epic. And the Homeric Hymn to Apollo is one of a set of Homeric hymns that are produced really between 700 and 550 BC, maybe 525. So they're an archaic creation, and they fall kind of more in line with the epic didactic side of the equation. That's one of our sources. And there we talk about the installation of Apollo's cult at Delos and at Delphi. And so there we're getting at a number of his functions, because as we meet in the beginning, we meet, let me not forget to sing of Apollo who shoots from afar. So he's the god of arrows. In Zeus's house, the immortals shake at Apollo's arrival. Rising up in their seats as he tightens his wonderful bow. Leto alone keeps her place at the side of Zeus. It is she who loosens his bowstring, she who closes his quiver. So we get at the parentage of Apollo, so we're getting basic information. We get the fact that his sister, or close associate, is Artemis. Different places where he's important. So we get at a number of functions, but the primary purpose of the Homeric hymn is to show us those two great cult centers where he has oracles, and his omniscience is on display. It goes without saying that he's also very powerful. The other major source in this book is that speaks to his functions is from Ovid, right, on pages 180 and following. Not super interesting as a source, but worth considering for no other reason than that it demonstrates his knowledge in one more place. In that chapter, we talk about Apollo's typical experiences in love. Apollo typically sees somebody that he's attracted to, male or female. He goes after them with a wild, unabandoned passion that is perceived as a threat by the person who has attracted his attention. And then that person, something awful will happen to him. And Apollo regularly destroys the thing that he loves, or the thing will die trying to get away from So he is kind of this weird figure. He's too awesome and powerful to be accepted into your world. And in this chapter, we hear about the girl Coronis, who attracts his attention, and there's a little bit of drama, which I won't crown with the girl. With the groan, the girl tore the dart away from her fair white flesh. She dies, and the thing that survives is her child. The child will become Aesculapius in Greek. Aesculapius is going to become the god of medicine. So we get one more function for Apollo. So his knowledge not only is omniscience about, about the fate of all humanity. It's not only knowledge of how to kill from afar, the bow and arrow. It is also a knowledge of how to heal. We will see also when we get to the very end of this book on the Trojan War that not only does Apollo know how to heal, he also knows how to send you death. He is also the plague god. He's called Lord of Mice, because they knew that plague was spread by sick mice, bringing it into your village. So what we get from Apollo, what we'll get in one more chapter in Apollo, on the chapter on Hermes, is we'll have to add to our Apollo mix, and we'll get his how it is that he ended up with the lyre, and therefore the means of becoming the leader of the Muses, and that points to yet another area of knowledge, an area that is the whole of the university system, the whole of the liberal arts is something that ultimately Apollo is in charge of. But the last aspect of his character that's on display there in that myth of Coronis is something that you see represented again and again with Apollo. That he is a really unstable, difficult, emotionally waxing kind of a person that reacts very quickly and can be quite a danger to anyone who gets involved with him. So he's a bit off-putting in that respect. And yet, at the same time, he is represented as the most handsome, the most regal. He is the pinup boy, the one that they would have found physically the most attractive, the way he was represented in their art and in their literature. And just to repeat, it is that business of knowledge as it's refracted through bow and arrow, the lyre, medicine, and omniscience about oracles. That's the one kind of consistent theme that runs beneath all of the aspects of his character, apart from the kind of touchy, nerdy aggression. My final thing on Apollo, he's not the god of the sun. People tend to look at him, he's not the god of the sun. There's a word for sun is Helios. So Helios is a god of sun. And there's also Hyperion. There's a cafe in town called Hyperion. It's Hyperion in Greek. And that was another sun god, but not Apollo. Right. So I know I kept you without a break, and in recognition of your patience and your ability to endure 10 minutes of talking about sources when you didn't need that talk again, I hereby release you from your obligations. So I shall see you again tomorrow. We will pick up with Hermes and Hephaestus and Ares, but really focus on Hermes. The Homeric hymn to Hermes is important both for Apollo as well as Hermes. And I'll look forward to reading your sheets. Have a good day.